street was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that made the smallest sounds carry. The buzz of an old streetlight hummed against the darkness, its glow spilling weak and yellow across cracked sidewalks. On the corner stood a weathered apartment building, bricks chipped, windows streaked with grime. Inside, a man sat alone at a kitchen table that had seen better days, the wood scratched and faded. The clock ticked on the wall, its hands pulling him further into a future he couldn't escape. He knew what was coming, even if no one else did. Somewhere out there, the past he thought had been buried was making its way back toward him. 2 decades earlier, the streets didn't look much different. The same peeling paint, the same empty lots where kids once played before the drugs and poverty swallowed up the neighborhood. Back then, he wasn't yet the man the world would come to know. He was younger, leaner, still carrying a kind of hope that the world hadn't completely beaten out of him. He had nothing, yet he carried himself with a pride that made people notice. And that was the same year 2 children, pale and hungry, showed up with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They were brothers, though anyone looking at them could see how life had already drained the softness from their faces. They met in a way that felt almost too ordinary to mean anything at the time. The boys had been sitting on the curb outside a corner store, their eyes darting toward the food inside like wild dogs sizing up scraps. He saw them there, skinny arms pulled into their shirts against the evening chill. For reasons he didn't even understand himself, he stopped. He didn't look away like most did. He asked them where they belonged. The answer was nowhere. Taking them in was not a decision made with logic. It wasn't safe, not for him, not for them. But something in him couldn't stomach the idea of leaving them behind. He had grown up knowing what it meant to be unwanted, to be invisible, and maybe that was why he made the choice he did. His small apartment didn't have much, but it was more than what those boys had. He gave them food, a bed, and a place where no one looked at them like they were trash. It wasn't easy. 3 months instead of 1 meant tighter nights, skipped meals, sacrifices he couldn't afford, but made anyway. The days turned into weeks, then months. The boys laughed again, though the laughter was rough, as if they had to relearn it. They argued too about small things, shoes, chores, who got the last piece of bread. But those arguments were proof of life, proof that they were still children underneath the scars. Slowly, a strange kind of family began to take shape. Neighbors noticed. Some whispered about why a black man would take in 2 white kids who didn't belong to him. The world had its ways of twisting kindness into suspicion. Still, he tried to ignore the stares. He focused on the routine, the mornings with cold cereal, the evenings with the boys' voices filling the apartment, the nights when he stayed up worrying about rent, but felt the weight of 2 kids breathing safely in the next room. It was fragile, that life, built on little more than good intentions and scraps of luck. And like all fragile things, it carried cracks invisible to the eye. There were moments even then when a shadow seemed to follow them. The past lives of the boys didn't vanish overnight. They carried the habits of hunger, the fear of being left again. Sometimes they woke in the night screaming, sometimes they hid food under their beds. He never blamed them for it, but it reminded him that the world outside his walls was always waiting to claim them again. He was fighting something bigger than hunger, bigger than poverty. He was fighting against a system that decided who deserved to survive and who didn't. And in the middle of all of that, there was he. A man who wanted to be more than what the world said he was, who wanted to prove, maybe even to himself, that he could matter, that he could protect, that he could be trusted. But the truth was, the world had already placed him in a box. To some, he would always be dangerous before he was ever seen as kind. To some, his skin was enough to erase any good he could do. He knew it, even if he tried to push it aside. What no one knew back then, sitting in that small apartment, was that the choice he made, to take in 2 boys who weren't his own, would ripple across decades. It would twist, it would turn, it would be buried under lies and mistakes, and one day it would rise again. The night would come when the man at the table would sit under that weak light, waiting for the past to decide whether it was going to save him or destroy him. The years passed, and what once felt like a fragile kind of peace began to shift under the weight of reality. Raising two boys who were not his own was never going to be simple. The kindness that had bound them together in the beginning didn't erase the scars they carried, nor did it protect them from the slow, grinding pressures of life outside their apartment. The neighborhood was harsh, the jobs were scarce, and every bill seemed to arrive with heavier ink. He worked long hours at whatever he could find, warehouse shifts, construction sites, odd jobs that left his hands raw. Yet no matter how much he pushed himself, the money always fell short. The boys were growing now, turning into teenagers with tempers and questions that had no easy answers. They wanted things, clothes that didn't look second-hand, sneakers like the other kids had, a life that looked normal. He tried, but the more he failed to meet their wants, the more resentment bubbled beneath the surface. They were old enough to feel shame about their situation, but not old enough to understand sacrifice. Sometimes, in their frustration, they turned that shame back on him. They didn't mean to cut so deep, but words from a child can wound like knives when you've given everything you have. It wasn't only poverty pressing down on them. There was the outside world, watching, whispering. Neighbors who once admired his generosity began to cast looks of suspicion. Why would a black man raise two white boys who weren't his blood? The boys themselves began to feel that pressure to owe kids at school taunted them, asking questions they didn't know how to answer. They were called names, told they didn't belong. That seed of doubt began to grow inside them. Were they really family, or just strays he had picked up until he grew tired? Arguments grew more frequent. Small things, chores left undone, voices raised at the dinner table, spiraled into nights of slammed doors and silence. The man felt the ground shifting under him, but he tried to hold on, to remind them of what they had built together. Sometimes, though, his voice carried more frustration than love. He wasn't perfect. Anger crept into his words when exhaustion dug too deep, and when his tone grew sharp, he saw fear in their eyes, the same fear they carried from before they ever knew him. That broke something inside him, but he couldn't undo it once it was done. Secrets began to surface too. The older boy started skipping school, running with kids who carried knives in their pockets and hate in their voices. He came home late, smelling of smoke and cheap beer, testing the boundaries of how far he could push before the man would break. The younger boy, quieter, carried his rebellion in silence. He kept journals hidden beneath his mattress, pages filled with thoughts he couldn't speak out loud. He felt torn, grateful for the man who had saved him, but confused by the whispers of people around him, whispers that made him question whether they were safe or being used. The man noticed these changes but didn't always know how to respond. He carried his own weight too, old memories of the system, of times when he had been accused of things he hadn't done simply because of who he was. He knew how quickly people like him could become the villain in someone else's story, and the fear of that never left him. He began to drink more on the nights when the boys stayed out late, the bottle a poor substitute for answers he didn't have. One night, everything cracked wider. The older boy came home bloodied, his shirt torn, a fight written all over his body. The man tried to demand the truth, but the boy snapped back, his words sharp and cruel, cutting through years of sacrifice. He accused him of keeping them trapped, of being no better than the streets they came from. The words landed like blows, and though the man said nothing in return, the silence was worse than shouting. From then on, a wedge sat firmly between them. The outside pressures grew heavier, bills piled higher, rumors spread wider. A landlord threatened eviction. Each problem pressed harder against the thin walls of that apartment, and every solution seemed to slip further out of reach. The boys, now teenagers, felt the pull of freedom, the desire to escape. to define themselves outside the shadow of the man who had raised them. And in chasing that freedom, they often clashed with the very person who had given them a chance to survive in the first place. Jealousy crept into the picture too, though not in obvious ways. The boys had begun forming connections outside, with people who offered them things the man couldn't: attention, validation, the promise of escape. To him, it felt like betrayal. To them, it felt like growing up. But in a house already full of unspoken tension, even small changes carried the weight of betrayal. As these fractures deepened, old wounds returned. The man carried guilt from his own past, moments when he had failed people he loved. He feared he was failing these boys too. He feared that the world would one day take them away, and he feared that he would be powerless to stop it. That fear often came out as control, rules, demands, and an insistence that they live by the structure he set. But teenagers resist control like fire resists water, and soon every rule became another battlefield. What none of them could see clearly was how all these struggles were twisting together, pulling them towards something irreversible. The boys felt trapped between gratitude and resentment, love and rebellion. The man felt torn between his desire to protect and his fear of losing control. Each of them carried scars the others couldn't see, and those scars were now shaping their choices. Behind closed doors, the shouting grew louder. The silences stretched longer. Nights ended with slammed doors, mornings with cold avoidance. And through it all, the city outside carried on, indifferent, merciless, waiting. The fragile world they had built together was cracking at every seam. It was only a matter of time before something, or someone, broke entirely. The night it happened was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and refused to let go. The city was restless. Sounds of sirens and shouting carried through the open windows of the apartment. Inside, the tension was thicker than the air outside. They had been arguing for hours, voices rising, falling, then flaring again like fire refusing to die. Words that should never have been said had been thrown into the air, sharp enough to leave wounds no one could see. The man sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, a glass half empty beside him. The older boy paced the small living room, his steps quick and uneven, fueled by a rag he couldn't contain. The younger one lingered near the door, torn between leaving and staying, his eyes darting between the two people he loved but no longer understood. It began with accusations. The older boy called him a liar, said he had ruined their lives by keeping them trapped in poverty, by pretending to be something he wasn't. The man, exhausted and raw, fired back with his own words, about sacrifice, about the roof over their heads, about how none of them would have survived without him. But the more he spoke, the less the boy heard. The anger had already drowned out reason. Then came the shove. The boy's hands against his chest, hard, sudden. The chair scraped against the floor as the man stumbled back. For a moment, everything froze, the sound of their heavy breathing filling the silence, the thrum of adrenaline running through the room. The boy's eyes were wide, daring him to respond. The younger brother whispered for them to stop, his voice breaking like glass, but there was no stopping. Years of tension, resentment, fear, and love twisted into something unrecognizable. The man lunged forward, not to hurt, but to hold, to restrain, to stop the boy from spiraling out of control. The struggle tipped into chaos. The table crashed sideways, the glass shattering across the floor. Hands grabbed, shoved, fought. Each was fighting for something different, the man for control, the boy for freedom, the younger one for peace. And then it happened, so fast it almost didn't seem real. A kitchen knife, left carelessly near the edge of the counter, was caught in the struggle. No one could say for sure who reached first, or if it was even a choice. But in the madness, the blade found flesh. A sharp, sickening sound followed by a scream that cut through the apartment like thunder. The older boy fell back, his hand pressed to his side,
blood rushing between his fingers. His eyes widened in disbelief, anger melting into shock, then into fear. The younger boy screamed his brother's name, rushing forward, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. The man stood frozen, his chest heaving, his own hands stained red without him realizing it. Silence followed, the kind that roars louder than any noise. The only sound was the boy's gasps, shallow and desperate, as the life drained from him. The man dropped to his knees beside him, pressing down, begging him to hold on. His voice cracked, words spilling out. Apologies, promises, pleas that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. The boy's lips moved, whispering something too soft to hear, before his body went still. The younger brother collapsed beside them, his face streaked with tears, his hands shaking so hard he could barely keep them on his brother's wound. He looked up at the man, his eyes filled with horror, confusion, betrayal. "You killed him," he whispered, his voice hollow, his body rocking as if he could will the moment away. The man couldn't answer. His mind was a storm, images flashing of when he first found them on the curb, of the laughter in the apartment years ago, of promises he had made to protect them, and now this. His body felt numb, his soul emptied in a single heartbeat. He wanted to believe it was an accident, that it wasn't his fault, but the blood on his hands told a different story. Panic set in. The younger boy's cries filled the room as the man staggered to his feet, pacing, pulling at his hair, trying to think. Call for help. Run. Hide. Every option felt impossible. He reached for the phone, then dropped it again, afraid of what the world would see if they walked in. A black man standing over a dead white boy. He knew how that story would be written before he even said a word. The younger boy crawled to his brother's body, clutching him, rocking him, whispering apologies he didn't owe. His grief was too big for the room, too raw to be contained. The man wanted to reach for him, to tell him it wasn't supposed to be this way, but he couldn't move. His legs felt anchored to the ground, his body frozen in the horror of what had just happened. Time blurred. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The apartment, once filled with voices, now felt like a tomb. The man finally sank against the wall, his breath shallow, his eyes hollow. He could already feel the world closing in on him. He knew this night would follow him forever, that no one would care about the years of sacrifice, the nights of hunger, the love he had given. All they would see was the blood, and somewhere deep inside him, a part of him knew the truth, that this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the breaking point of years of pain, silence, and anger. It was the moment everything they had built together crumbled to dust, and no matter how much he begged the silence to give him another chance, there was no undoing what had been done. The sirens arrived before dawn, washing the street in blue and red light. Neighbors stood at their windows, some whispering, some just watching with grim faces, as officers crowded into the small apartment. The scene was almost too familiar for this part of town. Another death, another arrest, another story the city would swallow and move on from. But for the man sitting in the back of the patrol car, with blood still drying on his hands, there would be no moving on. His life had just ended, even though his heart was still beating. Inside, the younger boy sat on the floor near his brother's body, silent, empty, staring straight ahead. He hadn't spoken much since the police arrived. His hands were still shaking, his shirt stained with blood he couldn't wash away. When officers tried to guide him outside, he resisted at first, clutching at his brother's body until they finally pulled him free. His cries echoed down the hall, carrying with them the sound of a boy whose world had shattered in one night. The man's arrest was fast and brutal. Neighbors whispered as he was led out in cuffs, their voices filled with judgment before they even knew the full story. To them, it didn't matter what had happened inside that apartment.
All they saw was a black man accused of killing a white boy. The narrative wrote itself before the ink of the official report even dried. The legal process moved quickly, as it always seemed to in cases like this. Prosecutors painted him as dangerous, violent, and incapable of restraint. They brought out photographs of the boy, his pale face frozen forever in youth, his life cut short. The younger brother was called to testify, his voice breaking as he recounted the night, his memory fractured by grief and trauma. He didn't have to accuse directly. His pain was enough to fill the courtroom with anger. The man's defense tried to explain. It was an accident, a struggle that went too far, years of tension boiling over into something no one wanted. They spoke of sacrifice, of love, of the years he spent raising boys who weren't his own. But their words fell flat against the weight of public opinion. The jury didn't see a man who had saved 2 children from the streets. They saw the crime. They saw the blood. And the verdict was sealed before deliberation even began. When the sentence came down, life in prison, there was no shock on his face. He had known from the moment the blade cut through flesh that this would be his fate. He had lived long enough to know how the system worked, how stories like his always ended. Still, the finality of it sank into him like lead, leaving him hollow, broken, and resigned. The younger boy's life twisted in ways no child should ever endure. He was moved into foster care, passed from one house to another, carrying the burden of grief wherever he went. Teachers saw him as troubled, peers avoided him, and the system treated him as just another number. Inside, he carried 2 truths that tore at him daily: that the man had saved his life once, and that same man had also taken away his brother. It was a wound that never healed, only scarred deeper with time. The community carried its own divided opinions. Some whispered that the man had been a fool for ever taking in those boys. Others called him a monster. Very few remembered the years of sacrifice, the meals skipped so 2 children could eat, the nights of protection when the streets wanted to swallow them whole. In the eyes of the public, all of that was erased by one bloody night. Media outlets fed on the story. Headlines spoke of betrayal, of danger, of a tragedy that was twisted into a simple narrative. A black man kills a white child. There was no room for nuance, no space for the messy truth of love and anger colliding in a moment of chaos. The story was consumed, judged, and filed away, like so many others. For the man in prison, days turned into years. Each night he replayed the moment over and over, wondering if there had been a way to stop it, a word he could have said, a breath he could have taken differently. He wrote letters that were never answered, prayed prayers that felt hollow. Guilt became his constant companion, the silence of the cell echoing louder than the shouts of the outside world. The boy, growing into a young man, carried the weight differently. He avoided talking about his past, but it bled into everything he did: his mistrust of people, his restless anger, his deep unspoken grief. He often wondered if his brother would have survived had they never met the man at all. But he also knew they might have died long before without him. The contradiction tore at him, but it was one he never voiced aloud. The crime didn't just claim one life, it fractured 3, and the echoes of it reached far beyond. It changed how people remembered them, how they were spoken about, and how they were judged. It left scars on everyone it touched, and those scars would never fade. 2 decades passed before the story came full circle. Time had weathered everything. City streets, the faces of neighbors who once whispered, and even the man himself. In prison, years stacked on years, until he was no longer the same person who had walked into that apartment in handcuffs. His hair had grayed, his back had bent, and his spirit had shifted from rage and grief into quiet acceptance. He had made peace with the idea that he would die behind bars. What he never expected was that the boy he once saved, the one who had stood shaking in that courtroom, would one day become the person to fight for his freedom. The younger boy, grew into a man carrying wounds that never fully healed. He had lived through the foster system, through loneliness, through the kind of pain that builds walls instead of bridges. For years, he hated the man who had raised him, the man whose arms had once felt safe, but whose hands had left his brother bleeding on the floor. But as he grew older, and his memories became less black and white, he began to see the layers. He remembered the hunger before they met him, the nights they would have spent on the street, the kindness that had been there before everything broke apart. He realized the truth wasn't simple. It never had been. By the time he was an adult, that realization turned into a quiet determination. He began looking deeper into the case, reading transcripts, piecing together what had been left unsaid. The more he read, the more he saw how the system had framed the story, how it had ignored years of sacrifice in favor of a narrative that was easy to digest. A black man killed a white boy. The world hadn't cared about the family they had built, only about the blood spilled in one tragic moment. The younger brother carried that contradiction inside him, rage at the man for the loss, gratitude for the life he had once given them. It was that complexity, that truth too messy for headlines, that finally pushed him to act. He spoke out, told the story from his perspective, and fought against the life sentence that had buried the man alive. At first, no one listened, but persistence has a way of cracking even the hardest walls. Eventually, his voice gained weight, his testimony drawing attention to the humanity that had been ignored. When the court finally reopened the case, it wasn't because the system wanted to. It was because someone who had lived through it refused to let the story stay one-sided. The younger brother stood before the judge, no longer a broken child, but a man carrying the truth. He spoke of nights when the man had gone hungry so they could eat, of mornings when he walked them to school to keep them safe, of years of sacrifice that didn't vanish because of one night of chaos. He didn't excuse the death of his brother, but he asked for the full story to be seen. The decision to overturn the sentence wasn't simple. It took time, hearings, paperwork, and battles fought in rooms where justice is often more about perception than truth. But in the end, after 20 years, the man walked out of prison, not free of guilt, not absolved of the blood on his hands, but finally given a second chance to breathe outside the walls that had stolen half his life. For him, freedom was bittersweet. The world he returned to was not the one he had left. Streets had changed, faces were gone, and the weight of years lost pressed heavily on his shoulders. He carried the memory of the boy he could not save with every step he took. He carried the knowledge that no freedom could erase what had been done. But he also carried the strange, fragile gift of forgiveness from the one who had survived. That forgiveness didn't erase the crime, but it softened the edges of a story that had once been nothing but tragedy. The case left ripples far beyond the 3 lives it had destroyed and reshaped. It forced people to look at the way stories are told, how race and power can twist the truth before it ever reaches the public. It raised questions about justice, whether it had truly been served when a man who had given so much was punished without mercy, while the complexities of his love and pain were erased. It showed how easily morality can be bent by perception, how quickly society casts heroes into villains when it suits the narrative. In the end, there were no simple answers. Justice had been both served and denied. A life was lost, another ruined, and another broken, but later rebuilt. The community, the system, the media, each had played a part in shaping the outcome, each carrying its own share of guilt. The story was never just about one crime. It was about love, twisted by pressure, about a system blind to nuance, about how power and race shape the stories we believe. The man lived his final years quietly, far from the noise that had once surrounded his name. The younger brother, now older himself, carried the weight of both grief and gratitude. Their story remained complicated, as all human stories are, filled with love and anger, sacrifice and loss, guilt and forgiveness. And maybe that was the point all along. that no life can be measured by one moment alone, that morality is not simple, justice is not clean, and human behavior is not easily defined. Theirs was a story of survival and tragedy, of failure and redemption, of the fragile threads that bind people together and the forces that can tear them apart.